Out from the hell that is Dunkirk, back from the steel thrust of the German war machine comes the BEF. For weeks they have been shelled and bombed from 3 sides. They had to stagger back to the sea to survive.
In approaching the historical event, the evacuation of the beaches of Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan had a very specific vision of how to tell this story.
The way I wanted to tell this film, the tension I wanted from this story, was that of suspense. Because Dunkirk is a great ticking clock story.
And it was one that stripped away the usual crutches of his style.
Changes your creative process, I think, but in an exciting way.
Gone are the usual convoluted plots and weighty themes.
Love isn't something we invented.
And with it, the over-reliance on expository dialogue.
60 minutes.
Can they make that route in under an hour?
They still have to climb down to the middle terrace.
Well, then they need a new route, a more direct route.
Which is replaced instead with dialogue that is mostly functional and often inconsequential.
Talkative sod, aren't you?
And not only that, but character backstories are gone as well.
I felt like I wanted to create a film where you didn't care about the characters on screen because they were telling you who they were and why you should care about them, or making the case for why you care about them. I wanted to just care about them using that wonderful thing about cinema that's very unique to cinema, which Hitchcock understood better than anybody, which is you'll care about a character on screen because of their physical dilemma, because of a task they're trying to accomplish, because you fear for their physical safety, because you wouldn't want to be in their position. And so I really wanted to very deliberately put the audience into the shoes of the characters on screen and create empathy that way in what I call the present tense. Not worrying about who they are or whether they've got a girlfriend back home or whatever, you know, the usual cinematic devices. I wanted to strip all that away and make a very, very kind of a lean, suspense-driven story.
And this focus on immediacy and creating suspense means that there is only really one way to tell this story.
Suspense is primarily a visual language. And suspense is a primarily visual language.
I wanted to address the story very much in the language of suspense. That's the most visual language of film there is.
However, this approach highlights a significant flaw in Nolan's filmmaking, one often overlooked but which can no longer be ignored. And that is he cannot direct action with the clarity needed to create suspense. In other words, he can't tell stories visually. But first things first, what is suspense? Francois Truffaut, in the introduction to his seminal book of interviews with Hitchcock, says suspense is simply the dramatization of a film's narrative material, the most intense presentation possible of dramatic situations. And that aligns with the literal definition. So in narrative terms, the suspense situation doesn't have to be life-threatening, it is just a situation wherein the audience is made to anticipate the outcome of an uncertain, dramatic event or situation.
Therefore, if any man can show any just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him speak now, or else hereafter forever hold his peace.
So in Dunkirk, the dramatic situation is simple.
It's about getting from A to B. Can they find a way off this beach?
But it is extended and complicated with a number of obstacles so that the anticipation and uncertainty are drawn out. By foregrounding suspense in this way, Nolan was taking his cue from some very specific sources.
Clouseau, Wages of Fear, in particular the French film from the 50s, was a big influence.
Clouseau in Wages of Fear.
Clouseau. I was looking at the cinema of Alfred Hitchcock,
and his great mastery of visual suspense.
Hitchcock, obviously.
However, he invokes these names at his own risk. During the interviews with Truffaut, Hitchcock laid out in no uncertain terms the keys to suspense, saying that, in the usual sense, it is indispensable that the public be made aware of all the facts involved. Otherwise, there is no suspense. What is so frustrating then is that given Nolan's acknowledged debt to Hitchcock, is how little he seems to have heeded this key lesson. Even in the opening scene, we can see many of the problems we're going to discuss later appear in embryonic form. We have this establishing shot, a wide view of a deserted village street with a row of 6 soldiers with their backs to us. At this point, they're an unindividuated mass, in line with Nolan's stated aim.
And ultimately the idea was the random nature of the violence. And so the idea that we would see a group of soldiers from behind and not see their faces and just see them killed one by one, other than one, who then becomes the protagonist. But the idea behind it is you don't know which one of them, it could be any of them, and it's irrelevant. And then you pick up the guy who happens to survive.
This is a fairly strong, well set up establishing shot. However, only a few shots later, we start to run into problems. This is an awkward shot. The soldier enters from frame left, facing the camera, but in the previous shots everyone had their backs to it, so the discontinuity of screen direction would imply that this new shot is a reverse angle. However, its positioning matches the direction of the establishing shot. We can clearly see the tap on the hose with a white door to its right and a soldier moving towards it. And so when we cut closer, the position of the camera matches that setup. We could intuit that the soldier has just turned around, though why would he do that? So the geography of this scene has already been ruptured and we don't know where we are physically. And it may seem pedantic to focus on this, but it speaks to a problem that will become more significant as the film progresses. A willful disregard of spatial integrity. And this scene only gets worse as it goes on. For example, this shot. Though it may seem an interesting frame, shooting from inside the house is counterproductive because it hides information. We don't know which house this is, or where it is in relation to the street as we've been shown it, so we don't know where this soldier is in relation to all the others. Sure, there's one in the background, but is it the same one who is the focus of this next shot? The lack of continuity in his taking his helmet off would have us think not. The out of focus soldier clearly doesn't have a helmet on, but I do think it's intended to be the same soldier, so this lack of clarity is really confusing. But all of these shots just seem to float, detached from one another, the spatial relationship between them never properly established. And all of this is confounded by the contrasting screen direction of these two. We have no way of knowing which of them is correctly oriented to the establishing shot. So any sense of bearing that the audience might have had is thrown out the window when they flee and change direction. Yes, we get a well-defined goal in the gate, but as we've not seen it before, it doesn't really help us. We don't know where it is in relation to the rest of the street, so we don't know where they're going. But if you actually put these two shots side by side, this wall gives us the answer. They've turned around, they're going back, but this is not made clear, and the audience shouldn't be expected to orient themselves around a bit of unemphasized set dressing. So all of this raises the question, why show us an establishing shot in the first place if you're not going to use the information it provides? The skeptic's response would be, well, why does it matter? What is the relevance of pointing this out? We can still understand the primary action of the scene, so isn't that enough? And to answer that, I'd like to direct your attention to this scene from The Dark Knight. Nolan has always had problems with screen direction and maintaining spatial integrity, and this is one particularly onerous example. There's a lot to say about this sequence, and the film critic Jim Emerson has already said a lot of it in his series In the Cut, which I highly recommend. However, I would like to draw your attention to one particular beat in this sequence. Watch that again. How does this truck change direction mid-crash? Well, we overlook such glaring problems for two reasons. Firstly, the shots are edited so quickly that they hardly leave an impression. And we're not able to process in real time how they're meant to be connected. And the filmmakers can get away with this for the second reason. This story beat is completely superfluous. This truck going into the water makes no difference to the narrative. It doesn't change anything and the scene just carries on as if nothing happened. There is no consequence to it, and so it's empty spectacle. And it's a similar situation here. Ultimately, this sequence only serves to do two things. Establish the omnipresent off-screen threat and the randomness of it, and to train the audience's focus onto the lone survivor who becomes the protagonist. Thus the logic here seems to be that because the characters are not important, the space is not important. Therefore there's no real narrative imperative that it be set up properly, especially as we're just going to move away from it soon anyway. What is important, however, is that there are passages later in the film where this is not the case, where it is absolutely essential that the audience have a clear and concrete understanding of the space in which the sequences are taking place. Yet the film follows the precedents set by its opening and plays fast and loose with how it orients us spatially. As Hitchcock said, a suspense situation is weakened because the action is not sufficiently clear.